Continuing our reading in Hellbent for Election by Phyllis Speshock, Chapter 21. At length the sun gave in, and so did Alexis, for we came to the end of the sidewalk and out onto a dirt path leading to the second church. This structure was severely plain and simply painted white. "It would appear," said Alexis, "that these members have gathered together to tend to business." "Quite right," I said. "Their own and everyone else's." He turned a pair of very round eyes upon me. "That was not nice, Hellbent. Taking him seriously is no offense, you know." "Of course not. But what they took seriously was their idea of him. They were one great little group of correctors. Why, I had attended the church only once when Flinty Outlook cornered me in the vestibule and said, 'I am a fourth cousin to Folly Transient on my mother's side. Let me assure you, Hellbent, that the inner conflicts of such a way of life are not worth the stolen moments. There is only one way to peace with him, and that is by restriction. We were not meant to taste forbidden fruits or pirouette through life, enjoying beauty or freedom. You will find that he is very jealous. Nothing must come before him. The very thought of foolishness is sin. There is calm within only when we walk in sobriety." "Howling winds," said Alexis. "Did you never interrupt the man long enough to tell him you realized your mistake and had tried to rectify it physically and had confessed to spiritually? Oh, besides, had he not read that a merry spirit does the good of medicine and a broken spirit dries up the bones? After all, if he chose to quote—" "I tried, Alexis, but he never heard me. Cutting all pleasures from life," he went on. "There is real joy. Confining oneself to everything we dislike, there is true compensation. That's the way he wants us to be, his very own." "How did you extract yourself?" "Well, actually, I never did until now. Each time we met, it was the same. I finally stood there staring, and he usually ended with, 'I see you're getting the idea, Hellbent. Why don't you come over to our home for dinner some Sunday?' "And did you?" "Yes, partly out of curiosity, I'm afraid, but mostly because I wanted to give myself every opportunity to come to love the man." "He was married?" "Oh, yes, he had 12 children. 12? But I thought—" "Oh, he explained it to me, Alexis. He got to me to one side and whispered, 'Oh, foul business, parenthood. It's the one process I think he could have given a bit more thought to, but then he did tell us to multiply.'" "Well," said Alexis, "did he think he could have improved the plan?" "Well, apparently," I said, though I never ventured to ask how. "Would you like to go inside?" "I'm not sure that I would like to," he said scintillatingly, "but since we are here—" The floors were of tile and the walls were painted gray. The pews were light oak, varnished to a sheen and with straight backs. Alexis sat in one of them and squirmed. "Now go on," he said. "Tell me some of the others you met here." I settled beside him and said, "Well, there was Mrs. Quite Unique. She had about the same views as Flinty Outlook, except that she didn't know about folly. She started in on me about the books I wrote. We are to give all our best to the Master," she said. "We are to praise and glorify his name. We are to be separate. We are to have no association with the worldly. We are his chosen ones, and we must keep to the rule of being exclusive. We must sever all outside contact. We must rend ourselves from temptation. Now, I have never been tempted to write, however, realizing that belonging to him makes me special." "Glazing sleet," said Alexis. "According to the data furnished by the office of the High Registrar, there was nothing so shocking." "And that's what I thought too, Alexis. But I hadn't done anything wrong. Of course, she had never read anything I had written, nor troubled to ask my motives. She simply assumed that if money and reputation went with it, it had to be bad. And it was no use trying to explain to her that he came into the world to save sinners. She was even a trifle suspicious of the missionaries' occupations. Let us be out of this place, said Alexis, shaking his head and showering sparks. We can talk along the way. It was drizzling when we started east again. Alexis immediately began to culture and repel seed pearls of moisture. For several seconds we walked in silence, and then I offered, you might like to hear about a sharp distinction. You remember I told you about Mrs. Parsimonius of the other church? She was quite set against being governed by the Old Testament. Well, sharp distinction was quite set in the opposite direction. He felt that the only right way was circumcised by unbreakable laws. The Ten Commandments, I trust? Oh no, though he somehow derived that all of his own laws were taken from those, I'm sure. And he was convinced that victory could only come when the entire world lived as he lived. Victory? What kind of victory? I'm sure I don't know, Alexis. But what were the rules? A mostly total abstinence from anything decorative, consumable, or pleasurable. He was a highly accelerated projection of a flinty outlook. It sounds formidable. He was. The criterion of his belief was to force his views on all the world, whether believers or not. He was known to have assailed strangers on the street and snatched tobacco from their person. On one occasion, he was said to have accosted a man coming out of a tavern and to have discoursed lengthily his version of temperance, which was complete restraint. I overheard him reprimanding a woman for her jewelry, and once he sent another weeping to the shepherd's study because he painted her face, or said she painted her face like Jezebel. He denounced all television, insisted that Christmas was a time of chastening the flesh, and demanded prosodic responses from all members of his immediate family. Dear, dear, said Alexis. What must the unbelievers have thought? Probably, I laughed, that the beginning of church knowledge was the fear of the brethren. For myself, I often wished I could have talked to Rahab. What an adjustment she must have had when she left Jericho and eventually married an Israelite. I wish she could have sat down with me and said, Hellbent, this is the way to get along with determined blind people. Well, he said, for all her being a harlot, her position in his presence is not one I would exchange for sharp distinctions, unless he mends his ways. As we have agreed before, the physical sins are bad, but they arise from the human fleshly nature. The sins of the spirit, however, come about by hellish means. Satan, may he writhe in chains of darkness, delights to inject into others the sins of his own downfall, and his methods are most insidious. For the moment any believer feels, for any reason, he is closer to him, more pleasing to him than others, he is immediately guilty of the cardinal transgression, pride. It may come about through attempted plainness, piety, self-denial, ignorance, incompetence, any of a dozens of ways of rejecting and disclaiming one's beauty, intelligence, or talent in favor of pretending humility. Really then, that is one of Lucifer's cleverest tricks, isn't it? Confusing us on the issue of humility. By rights, we should take pleasure in whatever good things he gave us, but also be capable of taking equal pleasure in what he gave others. Instead, we cringe and cower and claim ugliness and uselessness, which really discredits him. Exactly. And I have noticed that the same artificial values which caused men to feel correct before him thousands of years ago still persist today. Precisely what I have felt all along, Alexis, except that today we have drawn further out of his sight of him and more set than ever on turning a deaf ear. The remedy does not seem to me to lie in inflicting unfounded rules and regulations upon each other, but rather in aspiring to become the kind of being who will live automatically his laws without even being aware of them. Alexis turned and looked at me. It was getting foggy, and he appeared more radiant than ever, cast against a background of vapor. "And too bad," he said, "that you had learned those many things and have no wish to become the beneficiary But I turned away from him and answered coldly, "Don't get tricky with me again, Alexis. I'm only playing politics, getting along with you until such a time as you shall agree to my release. Besides, can you be so imperceptive as to miss the whole point of everything I say? I am arguing against them. If that necessarily involves arguing for him, well, of course," he said cheerfully. "Of course, Hellbent." But it did seem to me he sparkled and even emitted some kind of celestial music that was nearly tangible, like the far-off chorus of 1,000 sopranos singing and reverberating until I was not sure I had heard them or felt them, though I vowed the minute the sensation was past that I would certainly not ask, and he, bland and indifferent, walked on in that pedagogic pace. That's the end of chapter 21.